Hey guys, tonight we descend into the blood-soaked steppes of 13th century Mongolia, where one man's name became synonymous with terror across two continents, a name whispered in the darkest corners of history, carried on the wind like the screams of his victims, Genghis Khan. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. When you think of Genghis Khan, you probably imagine epic battles, vast empires, and maybe some romantic Hollywood nonsense about noble warriors on horseback. But strip away the mythology, peel back the legends, and what you find beneath is something far more chilling. A man who didn't just conquer territories, he conquered souls. He didn't just defeat armies, he erased entire bloodlines from existence. The punishments he devised weren't just about death. They were about sending a message so terrifying that cities would surrender at the mere rumor of his approach. We begin in the year 1162, somewhere in the vast emptiness of the Mongolian steppes. The world was a different place then. Europe was still crawling out of the Dark Ages. The Song dynasty ruled China with silk and poetry. The Islamic Golden Age was reaching its peak, and in the frozen grasslands between these civilizations, a boy was born who would make them all tremble. His name was Temujin, not Genghis Khan, not yet. Just a child born into a world where survival meant becoming harder than winter itself. His father was poisoned when the boy was 9 years old. His family was abandoned by their tribe. They were left to starve in a land where showing weakness meant death. And it was in those early years of abandonment and betrayal that something fundamental broke inside young Temujin, something that would never heal. Most children who experience such trauma become withdrawn, broken, defeated. But Temujin became something else entirely. He became calculating. He learned that mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford. That forgiveness was a weakness his enemies would exploit. And most importantly, he discovered that fear could be more powerful than any sword, more devastating than any army. The first glimpse of his future came when he was still a teenager. His half-brother Bekter had been stealing food from the family's meager supplies. In most families, this would have led to an argument, maybe a beating. But Temujin didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply took his bow, tracked his half-brother to a hillside, and put an arrow through his back. When his mother discovered what he had done, she was horrified. She called him a destroyer of everything, a mad dog that bites without warning. She was right. But she was also looking at the future ruler of the largest contiguous empire in human history. But to understand the true horror of what Genghis Khan would become, we need to understand the world that created him. The Mongolian steppes in the 12th century weren't just harsh. They were apocalyptic. Imagine a land where winter temperatures dropped to 50 degrees below zero, where summer brought drought so severe that entire herds would die of thirst, where tribal warfare wasn't occasional conflict, but a constant grinding struggle for survival. In this world, weakness wasn't just discouraged. It was a death sentence. Tribes that showed mercy to their enemies were wiped out. Leaders who hesitated in battle watched their people become slaves. Children who couldn't endure hardship simply didn't survive to adulthood. It was natural selection accelerated to its most brutal extreme. And Temujin wasn't just a product of this environment. He was its ultimate expression. The tribal culture that shaped him had its own codes of honor, its own concepts of justice. But these weren't the chivalric ideals of medieval Europe or the philosophical principles of ancient China. Mongol justice was simple, direct, and absolutely unforgiving. Betrayal meant death. Cowardice meant exile, which was often worse than death. And showing disrespect to a superior meant punishments that would make a medieval torturer pale. But even by the standards of his own people, what Temujin would become was extraordinary. Other tribal leaders might execute traitors. He would make their deaths into public spectacles that would be remembered for generations. Other warriors might raid enemy camps. He would systematically erase entire cultures from the face of the earth. The difference wasn't just in scale, it was in imagination. As he began his rise to power, uniting the fractured Mongol tribes under his leadership, Temujin developed what would become his signature approach to punishment. It wasn't enough to defeat his enemies. He had to make their defeat so complete, so horrifying, that others would surrender rather than face the same fate. This wasn't just military strategy. It was psychological warfare, elevated to an art form. The first major test of this philosophy came during his conflict with the Merkits, the tribe that had kidnapped his wife Borta in the early days of his marriage. For most men, rescuing their wife would have been enough. Victory would have meant getting her back safely. But Temujin didn't think like most men. When he finally cornered the Merkit forces, he didn't just defeat them. He made their defeat into a lesson that would echo across the steppes. The Merkit warriors who had participated in the kidnapping weren't simply killed. They were executed in ways designed to maximize both suffering and symbolism. Some were dragged behind horses until their bodies disintegrated. Others were buried alive up to their necks and left for the wolves. But the most chilling punishment was reserved for the Merkit leader who had ordered Borta's capture. Temujin had him tied between two horses and torn in half, but only after forcing him to watch the systematic execution of every male member of his family. This wasn't rage. This wasn't the hot blood of revenge. This was cold, calculated theater. A performance designed to send a message to every tribe on the steppes: cross Temujin, and your death will become a story that mothers tell to frighten their children. But even this was just the beginning. As his power grew, as he absorbed tribe after tribe into his growing confederation, the punishments became more elaborate, more psychologically devastating. He began to understand that the anticipation of suffering could be more powerful than suffering itself. That the threat of punishment, properly deployed, could accomplish more than actual violence. He developed what his followers would later call the psychology of submission. It wasn't enough to defeat an enemy. You had to break their will so completely that they would never consider resistance again. And this required punishments that went beyond physical pain, that attacked the very foundations of a person's identity, their sense of self, their connection to family and tribe. One of his earliest innovations was collective punishment. In most tribal conflicts, only the actual combatants faced consequences. Temujin changed this. When a tribe resisted his authority, he didn't just punish the warriors, he made the entire community pay the price. Elders who had counseled resistance were buried alive. Women who had encouraged their husbands to fight were sold into slavery. Children who carried the blood of rebellious families were adopted into Mongol households, their original identities erased forever. This wasn't random cruelty. Every punishment served multiple purposes. The immediate goal was to eliminate resistance. But the deeper purpose was to create a climate of fear so pervasive that future resistance would become unthinkable. And it worked. As word of these punishments spread across the steppes, tribes began surrendering without fighting. They would send emissaries begging for the privilege of joining Temujin's confederation, offering tribute, hostages, anything to avoid the fate of those who had resisted. By 1206, when the great Kurultai assembly proclaimed him Genghis Khan, universal ruler of the Mongols, his reputation for creative brutality had already spread far beyond the steppes. Chinese merchants carried stories of his punishments back to the Song court. Islamic traders whispered about them in the bazaars of Samarkand and Baghdad. European crusaders heard rumors of a demon king rising in the east, a man who could make death itself into a weapon of war. But becoming Genghis Khan only amplified his capacity for punishment. Now he commanded not just thousands of warriors, but hundreds of thousands. His empire stretched across millions of square miles. And with that expansion came new challenges, new forms of resistance, and new opportunities to demonstrate why crossing the Mongol Empire was the last mistake anyone would ever make. The punishments that had worked on nomadic tribes needed to be adapted for settled populations. City dwellers had different fears than steppe nomads. Agricultural communities had different vulnerabilities than herding societies. And Genghis Khan, with his genius for understanding human psychology, began developing new methods of punishment specifically designed for these new subjects. But before we dive into those urban nightmares, into the systematic terror that would make entire civilizations kneel before Mongol power, we need to understand one crucial fact about Genghis Khan's approach to punishment. It was never personal. Even when he was avenging the kidnapping of his wife, even when he was eliminating blood enemies, the emotions involved were secondary to the strategic purpose. Every execution, every act of brutality, every moment of calculated cruelty served the larger goal of building and maintaining an empire. The suffering wasn't the point. The message was the point. And that message was simple, elegant, and absolutely terrifying. Resistance is not just futile, it is unthinkable. This understanding would guide every punishment he devised, from the relatively simple executions of his early tribal conflicts to the mind-bending atrocities he would unleash on the great cities of Khwarezm, Persia, and beyond. Because Genghis Khan didn't just conquer territories, he conquered the very concept of resistance itself, and the punishments he used to achieve this conquest would become the stuff of nightmares for centuries to come. Now, as Genghis Khan turned his gaze beyond the familiar steppes toward the glittering cities of the south, he discovered something that would fundamentally change the nature of his punishments. Cities were different from tribes. They had walls, wealth, and most importantly, they had something to lose. Something beyond their lives. They had civilization itself. The first major test came with the Western Xia Kingdom, a buffer state between Mongolia and China proper. These weren't nomads who could simply disappear into the vastness of the steppes when defeated. These were people tied to the land, to buildings, to a way of life that had existed for centuries. And Genghis Khan realized that this presented him with an entirely new canvas for his artistry of terror. When the city of Yinchuan finally fell after a brutal siege, the Khan didn't simply order the usual massacre. Instead, he orchestrated something far more psychologically devastating. He divided the population into groups. The craftsmen, those whose skills were useful to the Mongol war machine, were spared and relocated. The nobles, those who had led the resistance, faced public execution. But it was the middle group, the ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, farmers, clerks, where his true genius for punishment revealed itself. These people were given a choice. They could volunteer to serve in the Mongol army's next campaign, fighting against their own neighbors and relatives in the next city. Or they could watch as their children were slowly tortured to death in the public square. Most chose to fight. And suddenly, Genghis Khan had not just conquered a city, he had turned its survivors into weapons against their own people. This wasn't just military strategy. This was psychological warfare that attacked the very foundations of human loyalty. Parents were forced to become traitors to save their children. Brothers were made to fight brothers. The conquered didn't just lose their freedom, they lost their identity, their moral certainty, their understanding of right and wrong. But even this innovation paled beside what happened when real resistance emerged. The Jin dynasty, controlling northern China, made the fatal mistake of demanding tribute from the Mongols. They sent an ambassador who knelt before Genghis Khan and declared that the Son of Heaven expected submission and annual payments of gold and silk. The Khan listened to this demand in perfect silence. Then he turned to the south, spat on the ground, and spoke 4 words that would echo through history. "I am the punishment." What followed was a campaign that redefined the very concept of warfare. When Mongol forces reached the first major Jin city, they didn't just besiege it. They turned the siege itself into a form of punishment. The inhabitants were allowed to see the Mongol army approaching. They were given time to prepare, to pray, to say goodbye to their families. The psychological pressure was allowed to build for weeks. Then came the demands. The city could surrender and face standard conquest, meaning death for the leaders and slavery for the rest. Or they could resist and face something new. Something that Genghis Khan called the Red Punishment, though no one in the city understood what that meant. They chose to resist. When the walls finally fell, the citizens discovered what Red Punishment entailed. Every person in the city was systematically bled to death. Not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, deliberately. Their blood collected in great cauldrons and used to paint the city walls crimson. The process took 3 days. And throughout those 3 days, the screams were allowed to carry on the wind to the next city, where defenders were already beginning to question whether resistance was worth such a fate. But Genghis Khan's true masterpiece of punishment came during his campaign against the Khwarezmid Empire, when he encountered the great trading city of Otrar. The governor of this prosperous metropolis had made what seemed like a minor error in judgment. He had seized a Mongol trade caravan and executed its members as spies. In most civilizations, this might have led to diplomatic protests, perhaps economic sanctions, maybe a limited military response. Genghis Khan's response was to create a new category of punishment entirely, something he called the lesson of prosperity. When Otrar fell, he didn't just destroy the city. He destroyed the very concept of the city. Every building was demolished stone by stone. Every tree was cut down. Every well was filled with rubble and corpses. The irrigation canals that had made agriculture possible were dammed and redirected. The very ground was salted to prevent future growth. But the inhabitants faced something worse than death. They faced systematic erasure. The adults were executed in ways designed to maximize suffering while minimizing the speed of death. They were buried alive in pits filled with burning coals. They were tied to stakes and slowly flayed, their skin removed in strips while they remained conscious. They were forced to drink molten silver until their internal organs liquefied. The children were taken away and given to Mongol families, but not as slaves or servants. They were adopted, their original names erased, their memories of home systematically destroyed through a process of controlled trauma and re-education. Within a generation, these children would grow up believing they had always been Mongols, would fight in Mongol armies, would help conquer their own original homeland without ever knowing it. This was punishment that transcended individual suffering. This was the punishment of history itself. Otrar hadn't just been conquered, it had been deleted from existence, and when travelers passed through the region years later, they found nothing but empty grassland where a great city had once stood. No ruins, no monuments, no trace that hundreds of thousands of people had once called this place home. The psychological impact of this erasure spread like wildfire across the trade routes. Merchants carried stories of the vanished city from Samarkand to Constantinople. Scholars in Baghdad wrote treatises trying to understand how an entire civilization could simply disappear. And in every city from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, rulers began asking the same terrified question. If Genghis Khan could make Otrar cease to exist, what could he do to us? But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these punishments wasn't their brutality, it was their logic. Every act of violence served a strategic purpose. Every moment of suffering was calculated to produce maximum psychological impact. Genghis Khan had discovered that fear was more valuable than gold, more powerful than any army, more lasting than any fortress. He began to systematize this knowledge, creating what modern military theorists would recognize as the first comprehensive doctrine of psychological warfare. His generals were taught not just how to win battles, but how to win wars before they began. How to use the anticipation of punishment to break enemy morale. How to turn rumors of Mongol brutality into weapons more effective than catapults or cavalry charges. The doctrine had three fundamental principles. First, punishment must be disproportionate to the offense. A minor act of resistance should face consequences so severe that major resistance becomes unthinkable. Second, punishment must be visible. It wasn't enough to destroy your enemies. You had to make sure everyone else knew exactly what had happened to them. Third, punishment must be memorable. It should create stories that would be told for generations, warnings that would echo through time. These principles guided every aspect of Mongol conquest strategy. When a city surrendered without resistance, its inhabitants were treated with relative mercy. They faced taxation, conscription, and cultural assimilation, but they lived. When a city resisted briefly, its leaders were executed and its wealth confiscated. But the general population survived. But when a city dared to resist seriously, to inflict casualties on Mongol forces, to delay the imperial advance, it faced punishment so complete that neighboring cities would surrender at the first sight of Mongol banners on the horizon. The genius of this system was its efficiency. After the first few examples of total destruction, resistance became increasingly rare. Entire kingdoms would capitulate rather than face the fate of Otrar. Armies would desert rather than fight forces that could make defeat mean not just death, but the erasure of everything they had ever cared about. But Genghis Khan's innovations in punishment weren't limited to military conquest. As his empire expanded, he faced new challenges from within. How do you maintain loyalty among conquered populations? How do you prevent rebellion among subjects who outnumber your warriors 1,000 to 1? How do you rule an empire so vast that news takes months to travel from one end to the other? His solution was to create a system of punishment so pervasive, so inescapable, that resistance would become literally unthinkable. He established networks of informants in every conquered city, rewarding those who reported disloyalty and punishing entire communities for the crimes of individuals. He created mobile punishment units that could appear anywhere in the empire without warning, dispensing justice that was swift, brutal, and designed to be witnessed by as many people as possible. Most importantly, he began to understand that the most effective punishments weren't always the most violent ones. Sometimes Psychological torture could be more devastating than physical suffering. Sometimes the threat of punishment could be more powerful than punishment itself. And sometimes mercy could be the cruelest punishment of all, when it came with conditions that destroyed everything the recipient valued. This understanding would guide the next phase of his reign, as he turned from conquest to consolidation, from building an empire to maintaining one. And the punishments he would devise for this new challenge would prove that his imagination for human suffering had no limits, no boundaries, no end. But the true horror of Genghis Khan's punishment system revealed itself not in the grand spectacles of conquered cities, but in the quiet, methodical way he dealt with betrayal within his own ranks, because nothing enraged the Khan more than disloyalty from those he had trusted. And when that rage needed an outlet, the results were beyond anything even his enemies had witnessed. The most infamous example came when his adopted brother Jamuka, once his closest friend and ally, finally fell into his hands after years of bitter warfare. Most conquerors would have simply executed a rival claimant to power. A quick death, perhaps a public beheading to demonstrate the futility of opposition. But Genghis Khan understood that Jamuka's death needed to serve a larger purpose. It needed to become a lesson about the price of breaking faith with the universal ruler. The execution took place over 7 days. Not 7 days of continuous torture, which would have been merely brutal. Instead, 7 days of carefully orchestrated psychological breakdown. Each morning, Jamuka was brought before the assembled Mongol nobles and forced to watch as one of his remaining followers was executed in an increasingly elaborate manner. The first day, a simple beheading. The second, death by 1,000 cuts. By the fourth day, victims were being slowly crushed beneath stones, while their families were forced to add weight to the pile. But it was what happened between these daily executions that revealed the true sophistication of Genghis Khan's approach to punishment. Jamuka wasn't kept in a dark cell or left to contemplate his fate in isolation. Instead, he was treated as an honored guest, fed the finest foods, given silk robes to wear, even provided with entertainment and conversation. This wasn't mercy. This was something far more calculating. The Khan wanted his former brother to experience hope each day, to believe that perhaps his status as a fellow noble might save him, only to have that hope systematically destroyed each morning in the execution ground. By the 7th day, Jamuka was no longer the proud warrior who had once claimed the title of Gur Khan. He was a broken man who begged not for his life, but for the privilege of dying quickly. And it was then that Genghis Khan revealed the final twist of his punishment. Jamuka would indeed die without the shedding of blood, as befitted his noble status. He would be wrapped in carpets and trampled by horses, his bones crushed to powder while his blood remained within his body. But even this wasn't the end of the lesson. Jamuka's children, rather than being executed, were adopted into the Khan's own household. They were raised as Mongols, trained as warriors, taught to revere the man who had destroyed their father. Within a generation, they had become some of Genghis Khan's most loyal supporters, leading armies in his name, conquering territories for his glory. The ultimate punishment wasn't death or torture. It was the complete conversion of your own bloodline into weapons against everything you had once stood for. This approach to punishment, turning enemies into allies through a combination of terror and strategic mercy, became one of the Khan's signature methods. When the Karait tribe betrayed him during a crucial battle, he didn't simply massacre their leadership. Instead, he created what he called the ceremony of adoption. Karait nobles were forced to publicly renounce their former loyalties, to declare that they had always been secretly faithful to Genghis Khan, that their resistance had been a misunderstanding orchestrated by evil advisors who had now been appropriately punished. These ceremonies weren't just political theater. They were psychological warfare designed to destroy the very concept of legitimate resistance. If former enemies could be made to publicly declare that opposition to Genghis Khan had always been wrong, if they could be forced to rewrite their own histories to align with Mongol propaganda, then future resistance became not just dangerous, but intellectually incoherent. The most elaborate of these ceremonies took place after the conquest of the Tangut Kingdom. The Tangut king, who had dared to refuse Mongol demands for military assistance, was brought before Genghis Khan in chains. But rather than facing immediate execution, he was offered a choice that would have been incomprehensible to rulers of earlier eras. He could die as a king, maintaining his dignity and his people's memory of his courage, or he could live as a servant, spending the rest of his days publicly praising the wisdom and mercy of his Mongol master. The Tangut king chose death, as Genghis Khan had known he would. But the offer itself served its purpose. Every other ruler in Central Asia now understood that resistance wasn't just punishable by death. It was punishable by the complete destruction of everything that made death meaningful. Your dignity, your legacy, your people's memory of who you had been. The Khan had weaponized shame itself, turning it into a form of punishment worse than any physical torture. But perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated punishment in Genghis Khan's arsenal was reserved for those who committed the ultimate crime against the Mongol state: cowardice in battle. Physical cowardice was bad enough, but it could be understood, even forgiven under certain circumstances. Moral cowardice, however, the failure to uphold the bonds of loyalty that held Mongol society together, was unforgivable. And the punishment for moral cowardice was designed not just to eliminate the coward, but to use their destruction as a tool for strengthening the loyalty of everyone else. The most famous case involved a Mongol general named Subutai's lieutenant, who had been caught fleeing from a battle against the Jin dynasty. Rather than facing a simple court-martial and execution, the coward was subjected to what Genghis Khan called the mirror punishment. He was forced to stand trial before an assembly of his own men, the soldiers he had abandoned in battle. But this wasn't a military tribunal. It was a ceremony designed to force every witness to confront their own potential for cowardice and to publicly recommit themselves to the standards of Mongol warfare. The coward was brought before his troops naked and bound, his weapons and armor displayed nearby but forever out of reach. One by one, his former subordinates were called forward to recount moments when this man had shown courage, had fought bravely, had embodied the Mongol ideal of fearless loyalty. With each testimony, the contrast between what he had been and what he had become grew more stark, more unbearable. Then came the second phase of the ceremony. Each soldier was asked to describe how the coward's flight from battle had endangered them personally, how his failure of nerve had forced them to fight harder, to risk more, to face death alone, because their leader had abandoned them. The psychological pressure wasn't just on the coward, who was forced to listen to a detailed catalog of how his moment of weakness had multiplied the suffering of everyone who had trusted him. It was on every witness who was forced to imagine themselves in his position, to confront the possibility that they too might someday face a moment when their courage failed. The actual execution was almost anticlimactic. The coward was trampled by horses, his body broken in the same way his courage had been broken. But the real punishment was what happened next. His name was not just erased from military records. It was replaced with a new word in the Mongol language, sutal, meaning the space where courage should have been. From that day forward, Mongol warriors didn't speak of cowardice as an act someone committed. They spoke of it as an emptiness, a void where valor should have existed. This linguistic innovation was typical of Genghis Khan's approach to punishment. He understood that changing how people thought about crime was more effective than simply punishing criminals. By creating new words, new concepts, new ways of understanding loyalty and betrayal, he reshaped the mental landscape of his empire. Resistance became not just dangerous, but literally unthinkable, because the language necessary to conceive of legitimate opposition had been systematically eliminated. The Khan's innovations in punishment extended beyond individual cases to entire systems of social control. He created the decimal system of collective responsibility, organizing conquered populations into groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. If any member of a group committed a crime against the state, the entire group faced punishment unless they immediately reported the criminal and participated in their execution. This wasn't just efficient law enforcement. It was the systematic destruction of the social bonds that might otherwise support resistance movements. Under this system, loyalty to family, tribe, or local community became a form of treason against the Mongol state. Parents were forced to choose between protecting their children and protecting their neighbors. Friends became potential informants. Marriage partners became surveillance assets. The most intimate relationships were weaponized in service of imperial control, turning love itself into a tool of oppression. The psychological impact of this system was devastating. In traditional societies, people drew strength from their connections to others, from their sense of belonging to communities that transcended political authority. Genghis Khan systematically destroyed these connections, replacing them with vertical relationships that led only to the imperial throne. You could trust no one horizontally, at your own social level. You could only look upward, toward the Khan and his representatives, for guidance, protection, and meaning. But even this wasn't enough for a ruler who understood that true power lay not in controlling people's actions, but in controlling their dreams. Genghis Khan began to develop punishments designed not just to eliminate specific forms of resistance, but to prevent people from even imagining alternatives to Mongol rule. These punishments targeted not just criminals, but the cultural foundations that made crime conceivable. When the city of Merv dared to revolt after its initial conquest, Genghis Khan didn't just destroy the city and execute its population. He ordered the systematic elimination of every cultural artifact that had made Merv distinct from other Mongol territories. Books were burned, not just for their immediate political content, but for their potential to inspire future cultural pride. Art was destroyed, not because it was subversive, but because it reminded people of a time when they had belonged to something other than the Mongol Empire. Most chillingly, the Khan ordered the execution of everyone who could read and write in the local script. Literacy itself was treated as a form of treason because literate people could preserve memories of pre-Mongol culture, could maintain connections to intellectual traditions that predated imperial conquest. The punishment for literacy wasn't just death. It was a specific form of execution designed to send a message about the dangers of intellectual independence. Literate prisoners were forced to eat the pages of books, to literally consume the knowledge that had made them dangerous to imperial authority. They were made to choke on their own learning, to die from the very thing that had distinguished them from the illiterate masses. And as they died, their children were forced to watch, to understand that education beyond what the Mongol state provided was not just forbidden, but lethal. This systematic assault on literacy and learning spread throughout the empire. In city after city, libraries were burned and scholars executed. But Genghis Khan was too pragmatic to eliminate useful knowledge entirely. Instead, he created a new class of state-controlled intellectuals, scholars whose only access to learning came through imperial institutions, whose only purpose was to serve imperial interests. These state scholars were forced to rewrite history to glorify Mongol conquest, to create new literary traditions that celebrated imperial power, to develop new forms of art and architecture that reinforced the message of Mongol superiority. They became living examples of what happened when intellectual independence was surrendered to political authority. Their elevated status within the imperial hierarchy was itself a form of punishment, a demonstration that even the highest forms of human achievement could be reduced to tools of oppression. The psychological sophistication of these cultural punishments revealed the true depth of Genghis Khan's understanding of human nature. He recognized that people could endure almost any physical hardship if they retained their sense of identity, their connection to something larger than themselves, their hope for a better future. But if you could destroy those intangible foundations of resistance, if you could make people forget who they had been before conquest, then physical oppression became almost unnecessary. The conquered populations didn't just submit to Mongol rule. They began to see themselves as naturally inferior to their conquerors, as people whose pre-conquest existence had been a form of primitive darkness from which Mongol civilization had rescued them. This wasn't just the result of propaganda or indoctrination. It was the result of punishment so comprehensive, so psychologically devastating, that they rewrote the fundamental assumptions people made about themselves and their place in the world. And yet, for all their sophistication, these punishments served a purpose that extended far beyond mere social control. They were part of Genghis Khan's larger vision of creating a unified world empire, a single political entity that would eliminate the wars and conflicts that had plagued humanity throughout history. The suffering he inflicted wasn't random sadism. It was the birth pangs of a new form of human organization, one that would theoretically bring peace through the complete elimination of political alternatives to imperial rule. Whether this vision justified the means used to achieve it is a question that has haunted historians for 8 centuries. But there can be no doubt about the effectiveness of Genghis Khan's approach to punishment. By the time of his death in 1227, he had created an empire that stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing more territory and more people than any single ruler had ever controlled. And he had done it not primarily through military conquest, though his armies were formidable, but through the systematic application of fear as a tool of statecraft. The punishments he devised didn't just eliminate his enemies. They eliminated the very possibility of effective opposition to his rule, and in doing so, they created a new model of imperial power that would influence rulers and conquerors for centuries to come. The Mongol approach to punishment became a template for totalitarian control, a demonstration of how terror could be used not just to suppress resistance, but to prevent it from ever forming in the first place. But the true masterpiece of Genghis Khan's psychological warfare wasn't revealed until he faced his greatest challenge, the conquest of China itself. The Jin dynasty represented everything the Mongols were not: ancient, sophisticated, protected by walls that had stood for centuries. Their cities were marvels of engineering. Their armies were equipped with weapons the steppes had never seen. Their culture stretched back thousands of years, creating a sense of superiority so deeply ingrained that many Chinese believed the Mongols were barely human. This presented Genghis Khan with a unique opportunity. If he could break the Jin dynasty not just militarily, but psychologically, if he could make the most advanced civilization on Earth kneel before nomad horsemen, then no future enemy would ever believe they could resist Mongol power. The conquest of China wouldn't just expand his empire. It would shatter the very concept that civilization could protect anyone from his wrath. The siege of Zhongdu, the Jin capital, became a laboratory for new forms of punishment designed specifically for urban populations. Unlike nomadic tribes that could scatter when defeated, city dwellers were trapped within their walls. They couldn't flee, couldn't disappear into vast landscapes. They could only wait and hope, and slowly come to understand that hope itself was the cruelest torture Genghis Khan could inflict. The siege lasted over a year, but this wasn't a conventional blockade designed to starve the defenders into submission. Instead, the Khan ordered the construction of massive mirrors, polished metal surfaces positioned around the city walls. These mirrors served no military purpose. They couldn't breach walls or stop arrows, but they could reflect images, and what they reflected was carefully choreographed theater of horror. Every morning, the mirrors were positioned to show the defenders something new. The first week, they reflected images of Mongol soldiers practicing their archery, demonstrating the precision with which they could pick off individual defenders. The second week, the mirrors showed massive piles of supplies, endless herds of cattle, vast quantities of grain. A visual reminder that while the city starved, the Mongols feasted. But it was the third week when the true purpose of the mirrors became clear. They began reflecting images of other Chinese cities that had already fallen. Prisoners from these cities were paraded before the mirrors, their faces clearly visible to the defenders of Zhongdu. These weren't just any prisoners. They were people the defenders recognized, relatives who lived in other cities, merchants who had traded in Zhongdu's markets, scholars who had studied in the capital's universities. The prisoners weren't being tortured or executed. They were being displayed as examples of successful surrender, well-fed, properly clothed, apparently unharmed. But there was something wrong with their faces, something that made the defenders feel sick even though they couldn't quite identify what it was. It took weeks before someone realized what they were seeing. The prisoners' eyes had been altered, not removed, not damaged, but changed. They reflected light differently, as if they were seeing the world through fundamentally different eyes. Later, survivors would learn that Genghis Khan had ordered the development of a new form of psychological punishment. Prisoners who had witnessed the fall of their cities were subjected to a process he called the adjustment of vision. They were forced to watch specially designed displays, images and patterns that gradually altered their perception of reality. Not through physical damage to their eyes, but through systematic exposure to visual stimuli that rewired their understanding of what was normal, what was acceptable, what was inevitable. These adjusted prisoners weren't just propaganda tools. They were living demonstrations of what happened to human consciousness under Mongol rule. They had been transformed from proud Chinese citizens into something else entirely. Not slaves, not victims, but willing participants in their own subjugation. They spoke of Genghis Khan not with fear, but with genuine admiration. They described Mongol conquest not as defeat, but as liberation from the burden of false pride. The defenders of Zhongdu, watching these displays through the mirrors, began to experience a form of collective madness. They couldn't trust their own eyes, couldn't be sure whether what they were seeing was real or some elaborate illusion. The uncertainty was more devastating than any physical assault. Soldiers began abandoning their posts, not from cowardice, but from the simple inability to understand what they were fighting for or against. When the city finally fell, it wasn't from starvation or military assault. It was from what modern psychologists would recognize as mass psychological breakdown. The defenders opened the gates themselves, convinced that resistance had never been possible, that their suffering had been caused not by Mongol aggression, but by their own stubborn refusal to accept the inevitable. The aftermath of Zhengdu's fall revealed the full scope of Genghis Khan's innovation in urban punishment. Rather than the usual massacre or mass enslavement, he implemented what he called the redistribution of identity. The city's population was systematically reorganized according to skills and loyalty levels. But this wasn't simple conscription or slavery. It was something far more sophisticated. Families were separated, but not randomly. Children were removed from parents who had shown signs of resistance and placed with families who had collaborated with Mongol forces. But the collaborative families were also broken up, their children distributed among former resistors who were now responsible for raising the offspring of traitors. The psychological complexity of this arrangement was staggering. No one could maintain simple loyalties anymore. Everyone was simultaneously victim and victimizer, oppressed and oppressor. The city's scholars and administrators faced a particularly sophisticated form of punishment. Rather than execution or exile, they were offered positions within the expanding Mongol bureaucracy. But acceptance came with conditions that gradually stripped away everything that had once defined their identity. They had to publicly renounce Chinese cultural superiority. They had to participate in the execution of former colleagues who refused to collaborate. Most devastatingly, they had to help design new punishments for future Chinese cities that dared to resist. This wasn't just co-optation of enemy elites. It was the systematic corruption of everything they had once believed in. These scholars became living examples of intellectual and moral collapse. Their elevated positions within Mongol administration serving as constant reminders that even the highest achievements of Chinese civilization could be reduced to tools of barbarian conquest. But Genghis Khan's most psychologically devastating innovation was reserved for the city's religious leaders. Buddhism and Confucianism weren't just belief systems in Chinese society. They were the foundations of social order, the sources of moral authority that legitimized resistance to unjust rule. These philosophies had to be not just suppressed, but perverted, turned into weapons against the very people they had once comforted. Buddhist monks were forced to participate in mass executions, their vows of non-violence systematically violated under threat of watching their temples burned with congregants inside. But they weren't just forced to kill. They were required to develop theological justifications for their actions, to create new interpretations of Buddhist doctrine that portrayed Mongol conquest as a form of divine judgment, a necessary purification of Chinese society. Confucian scholars faced an even more complex form of torture. They were forced to rewrite the classical texts, inserting passages that portrayed nomadic conquest as the natural order of things, that described Chinese resistance as a violation of the very harmony their philosophy claimed to protect. These altered texts were then distributed throughout the empire, creating a version of Chinese culture that justified its own destruction. The psychological impact of these religious punishments extended far beyond the immediate victims. When monks blessed Mongol soldiers and Confucian scholars praised barbarian wisdom, the fundamental assumptions that held Chinese society together began to crumble. If the guardians of morality could be corrupted so completely, if the sources of spiritual authority could be turned into instruments of oppression, then what meaning did resistance have? What hope could there be for maintaining cultural integrity in the face of such comprehensive assault? This destruction of moral authority became one of Genghis Khan's most effective tools for preventing future rebellion. Physical resistance could be organized around charismatic leaders or desperate circumstances, but psychological resistance required a sense of moral legitimacy, a belief that opposing Mongol rule was not just strategically possible, but ethically necessary. By corrupting the sources of that legitimacy, the Khan made rebellion not just dangerous, but intellectually incoherent. The success of these psychological punishments in China led to their systematic application throughout the expanding Mongol Empire. When the armies turned west toward the Islamic world, they carried with them not just weapons and siege engines, but a comprehensive understanding of how to break civilizations from within. The punishments that had worked on Chinese cities were adapted for Persian culture, modified for Central Asian traditions, refined for European sensibilities. Each conquest became a laboratory for new forms of psychological warfare. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258, though it occurred after Genghis Khan's death, followed principles he had established. The systematic elimination of Islamic scholars, the corruption of religious authorities, the redistribution of family structures. These weren't random acts of violence, but carefully planned operations designed to prevent the emergence of organized resistance for generations to come. The Mongol approach to punishment had evolved from the brutal but simple executions of steppe warfare into something unprecedented in human history, a comprehensive system for the destruction and reconstruction of human consciousness itself. Victims weren't just killed or enslaved. They were transformed into active participants in their own oppression, willing advocates for the system that had destroyed everything they had once valued. This transformation was perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Genghis Khan's legacy. His punishments didn't just eliminate his enemies. They eliminated the possibility of future enemies by rewiring the fundamental assumptions that made opposition conceivable. The conquered didn't just submit to Mongol rule. They came to see it as the natural order of things, as an improvement over the chaotic and primitive systems that had existed before imperial unification. But the true genius of this system was its self-perpetuating nature. The victims of Mongol punishment became its agents, spreading the techniques they had experienced to new territories, refining and improving methods of psychological control. The empire expanded not just through military conquest, but through the voluntary adoption of Mongol techniques by local rulers who had learned their effectiveness firsthand. By the time of Genghis Khan's death in 1227, he had created more than an empire. He had created a new form of human organization based on the systematic application of fear as a tool of governance. The punishments he had devised weren't just methods of maintaining control. They were the foundation of a political system that could theoretically expand without limit, incorporating any culture, any belief system, any form of resistance into its own structure. The horror of this achievement lay not in its brutality, though that was certainly extreme, but in its elegance. Genghis Khan had solved the fundamental problem of imperial rule, how to control populations that vastly outnumber their conquerors. His solution was to make those populations complicit in their own oppression, to transform potential rebels into willing collaborators through punishments so sophisticated that victims came to see their suffering as education, their defeat as liberation. This was punishment elevated to the level of art, cruelty refined into statecraft, terror transformed into a technology of governance that would influence human civilization for centuries to come. And perhaps most chilling of all, it worked. The Mongol Empire became the largest contiguous land empire in human history, not despite its reliance on psychological punishment, but because of it. The steppes had produced more than a conqueror. They had produced a new understanding of what human beings could be made to endure, to accept, and ultimately to embrace. An understanding that would echo through the corridors of power long after the last Mongol horse had thundered across the grasslands of Asia. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Genghis Khan's system wasn't what happened to those who openly defied him. It was what happened to those who tried to stay neutral, who hoped to avoid his attention entirely by neither supporting nor opposing his conquests. Because the Khan understood something that would later be recognized by totalitarian rulers throughout history. Neutrality itself was a form of resistance, and it required its own unique form of punishment. The city of Gurganj, the jewel of Khwarezm, thought it could avoid the fate of other cities by simply closing its gates and waiting. Not fighting, not surrendering, just existing in a state of hopeful invisibility. When Mongol scouts appeared on the horizon, the city's leaders sent neither defiant messages nor offers of submission. They sent nothing at all. They believed that silence would save them. Genghis Khan's response was to create what he called the punishment of patience. His armies surrounded Gurganj, but made no immediate moves to attack. Instead, they began construction projects, not siege engines or assault towers, but something far more psychologically devastating. They built mirrors, hundreds of them, arranged in precise geometric patterns around the city walls. During the day, these mirrors reflected sunlight directly into the city, creating an unbearable glare that made normal life impossible. But it was at night when their true purpose became clear. By moonlight and torchlight, the mirrors created an optical illusion that made the Mongol army appear infinite. A few thousand warriors looked like hundreds of thousands, their images multiplied and distorted until the very concept of resistance became meaningless. But the mirrors served another purpose. They reflected the city back to itself, creating a distorted image where familiar buildings looked alien and threatening. Streets that had been walked for generations suddenly appeared foreign. The psychological impact was devastating. Inhabitants began to feel like strangers in their own home, disconnected from the place they were trying to protect. The siege lasted 3 months, not because the city was particularly well defended, but because Genghis Khan wanted the surrounding region to watch. He needed other neutral cities to see what happened when you tried to ignore the Mongol Empire. The message wasn't just that resistance was futile. It was that neutrality was impossible. When Gurganj finally fell, its fate was unlike anything that had come before. The population wasn't massacred or enslaved. Instead, they were subjected to what the Khan called the ceremony of recognition. Every inhabitant was brought before Mongol officials and asked a simple question: who rules this city? Those who answered Genghis Khan were released and allowed to return to their homes. Those who answered no one or we have no ruler were taken away for re-education. And those who named the city's actual leaders were rewarded with positions in the new Mongol administration. The ceremony wasn't about gathering information. The Khan already knew who had ruled Gurganj. It was about forcing every person in the city to make a choice, to publicly declare their loyalty to Mongol authority or face the consequences of continued neutrality. Neutrality, it turned out, was simply another form of rebellion, and rebellion had its price. The re-education process for those who claimed to have no ruler was particularly sophisticated. They weren't tortured or killed. Instead, they were subjected to what modern psychologists would recognize as systematic indoctrination. Kept in comfortable conditions but constantly exposed to Mongol success stories, examples of cities that had prospered under imperial rule, demonstrations of the chaos and suffering that existed in territories not yet blessed with Mongol administration. More importantly, they were shown detailed accounts of what happened to cities that had chosen active resistance, not propaganda or exaggerated stories, but accurate, carefully documented records of the fates of places like Otrar and Samarkand. The message was clear. If neutrality led to re-education and submission led to prosperity, what did active resistance lead to? Within weeks, these neutral prisoners were begging to be allowed to serve the Mongol Empire. Not from fear of punishment, but from genuine conviction that they had been foolish to ever imagine that any alternative to Mongol rule was possible or desirable. They had been transformed from neutral observers into active collaborators, and they embraced their new role with the fervor of true converts. This transformation of neutrals into supporters became one of the most effective tools in the Mongol arsenal. Cities that had hoped to avoid involvement in imperial expansion suddenly found themselves providing troops, supplies, and intelligence for Mongol campaigns against their former allies. The conquered became the conquerors, spreading the empire not through their defeat, but through their conversion. But Genghis Khan's innovations in punishment weren't limited to grand strategic campaigns. Some of his most psychologically devastating techniques were reserved for individual cases, personal betrayals that required personal responses. And nowhere was this more evident than in his treatment of captured enemy commanders, who had shown particular skill or courage in their resistance. Most conquerors would simply execute such men, removing dangerous enemies from the field of battle. But the Khan recognized that skilled enemy commanders represented something more valuable than just military threats. They represented opportunities to demonstrate the superiority of Mongol methods over traditional forms of warfare and leadership. When the Khwarezmid general Inalchuk was finally captured after months of brilliant tactical resistance, Genghis Khan could have made him into a martyr by granting him an honorable death in combat. Instead, he chose to make him into a lesson. Inalchuk was brought before the assembled Mongol army, not as a prisoner, but as a guest of honor. For 7 days, he was treated with every courtesy due to a respected military commander. He dined with Mongol generals, discussed tactics and strategy, was shown the weapons and techniques that had made Mongol armies so successful. He was even invited to observe training exercises, to see firsthand how Mongol discipline and organization exceeded anything he had ever commanded. On the surface, this appeared to be an elaborate form of psychological torture, forcing a proud general to witness the superiority of his enemies. But the true purpose was far more subtle. Genghis Khan was conducting an education, not just of Inalchuk, but of every Mongol officer who witnessed the proceedings. By the end of the 7 days, Inalchuk had been transformed from a dangerous enemy into something more valuable, a voluntary advocate for Mongol military methods. He publicly acknowledged that his resistance had been based on ignorance of Mongol capabilities. He praised the organization, discipline, and strategic thinking of his captors. He even offered to help train Mongol officers in the defensive tactics he had used so effectively against them. This wasn't coercion or torture extracting false confessions. This was genuine intellectual conversion. A proud and intelligent man coming to understand that everything he had believed about warfare had been primitive compared to Mongol innovations. The transformation was so complete that when Inalchuk was offered his freedom, he chose instead to remain with the Mongol army as an advisor. The psychological impact on Mongol officers was profound. They had witnessed not just the defeat of a skilled enemy, but his voluntary transformation into an ally. The message was clear. Mongol methods weren't just militarily superior, they were intellectually superior. Any rational person who truly understood them would choose to embrace rather than resist them. This technique of intellectual conversion became standard practice for dealing with captured enemy elites. Rather than creating martyrs through execution, Genghis Khan created advocates through education. Former enemies became some of his most effective recruiters, able to speak to potential resistors in their own language, using their own cultural references to explain why submission to Mongol rule was not just inevitable, but desirable. But perhaps the most chilling example of the Khan's approach to individual punishment came in his treatment of the Khwarezmid prince Jalal ad-Din, a man who had shown not just military skill, but the kind of charismatic leadership that could inspire long-term resistance to Mongol rule. Unlike other captured commanders who were converted through intellectual persuasion, Jalal ad-Din represented a different kind of threat. His appeal wasn't based on military competence, but on his ability to embody the hopes and dreams of his people. Such men couldn't be converted through education or intimidation. They had to be broken in ways that would shatter not just their own will, but the faith their followers placed in them. And for this, Genghis Khan developed what he called the punishment of dreams. Jalal ad-Din wasn't executed or imprisoned. Instead, he was granted a form of freedom that was more devastating than any chain. He was released to return to his people, but with conditions that made heroic leadership impossible. He was required to report regularly to Mongol administrators, to provide detailed intelligence about potential resistance movements, to participate in the execution of anyone found plotting against imperial authority. Most devastatingly, he was required to marry a Mongol noblewoman, a political alliance that made him complicit in his own people's subjugation. His children would be raised as Mongols, educated in Mongol schools, trained to see their father's former resistance as primitive barbarism that their superior Mongol heritage had saved them from. The psychological torture of this arrangement was exquisite. Jalal ad-Din remained technically free, technically a leader among his people. But every action he took served Mongol interests. Every word he spoke was monitored and reported. Every relationship he formed became a tool of imperial surveillance. He had been transformed from a symbol of resistance into a living demonstration of its futility. His former followers, watching their hero reduced to a Mongol collaborator, faced a choice between maintaining their loyalty to a broken man or transferring their allegiance to the empire that had broken him. Most chose the latter. Within a generation, stories of Jalal ad-Din's heroic resistance were being told as cautionary tales about the dangers of opposing Mongol wisdom. This destruction of heroic narratives became one of Genghis Khan's most effective long-term strategies. By converting heroes into collaborators, he didn't just eliminate individual threats. He eliminated the entire concept of heroic resistance from conquered cultures. Future generations grew up in a world where the greatest figures of their past were remembered not as martyrs to be emulated, but as examples of men who had eventually come to understand the superiority of Mongol rule. The psychological sophistication of these individual punishments revealed the true depth of Genghis Khan's understanding of human motivation. He recognized that people could endure almost any physical hardship if they retained their heroes, their symbols of resistance, their belief that opposition to tyranny was noble and meaningful. But if you could corrupt those heroes, if you could make resistance itself seem primitive and foolish, then physical oppression became almost unnecessary. The conquered populations didn't just submit to Mongol authority. They came to see submission as a sign of intelligence and sophistication, while resistance became associated with ignorance and backwardness. This wasn't just the result of propaganda. It was the result of punishment so psychologically devastating that they rewrote the fundamental categories through which people understood courage, honor, and loyalty. But even these individual masterpieces of psychological manipulation paled beside Genghis Khan's greatest innovation in the field of punishment: the systematic use of mercy as a weapon of terror. Most conquerors understood that cruelty could inspire fear. The Khan was perhaps the first to understand that mercy, properly deployed, could be even more psychologically devastating than the most elaborate torture. The principle was simple but profound. If your reputation for brutality was absolute, then any deviation from that brutality became a form of psychological warfare. Unexpected mercy didn't just spare individual lives. It created a sense of unpredictability that was more terrifying than consistent cruelty. People could prepare themselves mentally for torture and death. They couldn't prepare themselves for the possibility that their captors might suddenly decide to spare them. The most famous example came during the siege of Bukhara, when Genghis Khan announced that anyone who emerged from the city and publicly renounced their allegiance to the Khwarezmid Sultan would be spared and allowed to return to their homes. This offer was so unprecedented that most inhabitants assumed it was a trap, a cruel joke designed to lure them out for mass execution. But when the first brave volunteers emerged and were indeed spared, word spread throughout the city like wildfire. The psychological impact was devastating. If Genghis Khan could show mercy to some, why was anyone choosing to die? What loyalty could be worth such a sacrifice when forgiveness was available for the asking? Within days, the city's defenders began deserting en masse, not from cowardice, but from the simple inability to justify continued resistance when survival was being offered freely. The genius of this approach was that it forced every defender to make an individual moral choice. Traditional siege warfare created a collective identity of resistance. Everyone faced the same fate, so everyone could maintain the same commitment. But when mercy was offered selectively, resistance became a personal decision that each individual had to justify to themselves and their families. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Soldiers, who had been prepared to die for their city, found themselves unable to explain to their wives and children why they were choosing death over the mercy their enemies offered. The bonds of collective resistance dissolved into individual calculations of self-interest. But the true brilliance of the mercy weapon revealed itself in what happened after Bukhara's surrender. Those who had accepted Mongol mercy weren't just spared. They were elevated, given positions of authority within the new imperial administration, rewarded for their wisdom in recognizing the futility of resistance. They became living advertisements for the benefits of submission, walking proof that Mongol rule was not just inevitable, but desirable. Meanwhile, those who had continued to resist until the very end faced not execution, but something more psychologically devastating. They were forced to watch their former comrades prosper under Mongol rule, while they themselves were relegated to the lowest social positions. The message was clear. Resistance wasn't just futile, it was stupid. The smart people, the successful people, the people who prospered in the new order, were those who had been wise enough to surrender early. This inversion of traditional heroic values became one of the most lasting effects of Mongol conquest. In most cultures, those who resisted to the end were remembered as heroes, while those who surrendered were seen as cowards or traitors. Under Mongol rule, these categories were reversed. Surrender became a sign of intelligence and foresight, while continued resistance became evidence of primitive thinking. The psychological impact extended far beyond immediate military situations. When word of Mongol mercy spread to unconquered territories, it created a new category of preemptive collaboration. Cities began surrendering before Mongol armies even arrived, their leaders calculating that early submission would be rewarded more generously than resistance followed by defeat. This weaponization of mercy became perhaps Genghis Khan's most effective tool for rapid imperial expansion. Territories that might have required years to conquer through military force fell without a battle when their inhabitants convinced themselves that Mongol rule would be beneficial rather than oppressive. The empire expanded not just through conquest, but through voluntary incorporation. But the most psychologically sophisticated application of mercy as punishment was reserved for those who had committed what Genghis Khan considered the ultimate crime. The betrayal of trust after mercy had already been granted. These weren't ordinary enemies who had fought and lost. These were people who had been forgiven, elevated, given new chances at life and prosperity, only to abuse that generosity by returning to opposition. Such individuals faced what the Khan called the punishment of understanding. They weren't executed quickly or tortured elaborately. Instead, they were subjected to a process designed to make them fully comprehend the magnitude of their error, not just in strategic terms, but in moral ones. The process began with education. The betrayer was forced to study detailed records of every act of mercy Genghis Khan had ever shown, every enemy who had been spared, every city that had prospered under Mongol rule after initial resistance. They were shown the fates of those who had accepted mercy gratefully compared to those who had rejected it entirely. Then came the personal component. The betrayer was forced to confront the specific consequences of their actions, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had trusted them. Their families, their followers, their communities, all now faced collective punishment because of their leader's decision to violate the mercy he had been granted. The psychological torture of this realization was exquisite. The betrayer came to understand that their defiance hadn't been heroic resistance to tyranny. It had been selfish indulgence that had brought suffering to innocent people who had trusted their judgment. Their moment of principled opposition was reframed as an act of profound moral irresponsibility. The final stage of the punishment was perhaps the most devastating. The betrayer was offered mercy again, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had suffered because of their actions. All they had to do was publicly acknowledge their error, praise Genghis Khan's wisdom and mercy, and spend the rest of their life serving the empire they had foolishly opposed. Most accepted, and in doing so, they became the most effective advocates for Mongol rule imaginable. Former resistors who could speak with absolute authenticity about the futility of opposition, about the genuine mercy of imperial authority, about the prosperity and peace that came to those wise enough to embrace rather than resist the new order. These converts became the backbone of Mongol administration in conquered territories. Their personal testimonies carried more weight than any propaganda, Their visible prosperity served as more effective advertising than any imperial decree. They were living proof that opposition to Mongol rule wasn't just militarily impossible, but intellectually incoherent. By the time Genghis Khan reached the height of his power, he had created something unprecedented in human history. An empire that expanded not primarily through military conquest, but through voluntary submission, based on the systematic application of psychological pressure. His punishments had evolved from simple brutality into a comprehensive system for the restructuring of human consciousness itself. The horror of his achievement wasn't just in the suffering he inflicted, though that was certainly extreme. It was in the elegance with which he had solved the fundamental problem of imperial rule: how to control populations that vastly outnumber their conquerors. His solution was to make those populations complicit in their own subjugation, to transform potential rebels into willing collaborators through punishments so sophisticated that victims came to see their defeat as education and their submission as liberation. The systematic perfection of these psychological weapons reached its ultimate expression when Genghis Khan turned his attention to what he called the architecture of submission. This wasn't about destroying cities or breaking armies. This was about rebuilding the human mind itself, brick by brick, until resistance became not just impossible, but literally unthinkable. The first laboratory for this new approach was the trading city of Urgench, a place so wealthy that its merchants had grown soft, so prosperous that its leaders believed their gold could buy safety from any threat. When Mongol scouts first appeared on the horizon, the city's rulers didn't prepare for siege or battle. They prepared for negotiation. They assembled vast treasures, convinced that the barbarians from the steppes could be bought off like any other problem. They were about to learn that Genghis Khan wasn't interested in their gold. He was interested in their souls. The siege of Urgench lasted longer than any previous Mongol campaign, not because the city was particularly well defended, but because the Khan was conducting an experiment. He wanted to document every stage of psychological breakdown, to map the precise process by which civilized human beings could be transformed into willing servants of their own destruction. The first phase was anticipation. Mongol forces surrounded the city but made no immediate move to attack. Instead, they began what appeared to be routine siege preparations. Catapults were assembled, battering rams constructed, scaling ladders prepared. But these weapons were never used. They were simply displayed, their potential for destruction demonstrated through daily practice sessions that the defenders could observe from their walls. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Every morning, the citizens woke expecting the assault to begin. Every evening, they went to sleep wondering if they would survive the night. Weeks passed, then months, with the promise of violence hanging over them like a storm cloud that never broke. The constant stress began to erode their sanity. But this was only the beginning. As the siege entered its second month, Genghis Khan introduced what he called the calendar of choices. Every week, the city was presented with a different option for surrender. The first week, only the leaders would be executed. The second week, only the military commanders. The third week, only those who had spoken against submission. Each offer was genuinely better than what had been available the week before. But each offer also had an expiration date. If the city didn't accept by the deadline, the next offer would be worse, not better. The psychological torture was exquisite. The defenders weren't just choosing between resistance and submission. They were watching their options deteriorate with each passing day, knowing that yesterday's rejected offer would seem generous compared to tomorrow's. The calendar created a form of temporal panic that was more devastating than any physical assault. Citizens began to turn against their own leaders, not from cowardice, but from the rational calculation that continued resistance would only make their eventual fate worse. Why die for principles when survival was still possible? Why sacrifice the future for pride when the price of that pride increased with every sunset? By the fourth month, the city's social fabric had begun to unravel. Families were divided between those who favored immediate surrender and those who still believed resistance was possible. Friends became enemies. Neighbors informed on neighbors. The external siege had created an internal civil war that accomplished what no army could have achieved. But the true genius of the calendar system revealed itself in what happened to those who argued for different positions. Those who advocated immediate surrender were labeled cowards by the resistance faction. Those who argued for continued defiance were called reckless by the submission faction. The middle ground, occupied by those who wanted to negotiate or delay the decision, was attacked by both extremes. Within the city, 3 distinct groups emerged, each convinced that the others were leading everyone toward disaster. The resulting paranoia and mutual suspicion created a surveillance state more effective than anything Mongol administrators could have imposed from outside. Citizens watched each other constantly, reporting suspicious conversations, documenting signs of disloyalty, building files of evidence against their neighbors. This internal surveillance system served multiple purposes for Genghis Khan. It provided detailed intelligence about the city's defenses, leadership structure, and potential resistance movements. But more importantly, it demonstrated to the defenders that their own neighbors were more dangerous than their Mongol enemies. Trust, the foundation of all organized resistance, was systematically destroyed. As the siege entered its 5th month, the Khan introduced a new element to his psychological warfare. Selected defenders were captured during nighttime raids, not to be executed or tortured, but to be educated. They were brought to the Mongol camp, shown the discipline and organization of the army, fed better food than was available in their own starving city, and engaged in conversations about the benefits of imperial rule. These captured defenders weren't interrogated for military information. They were interviewed about their personal lives, their families, their hopes for the future. Mongol officers listened sympathetically to their concerns, acknowledged the difficulty of their situation, and gently suggested that their suffering was caused not by Mongol aggression, but by the stubborn refusal of their leaders to accept reasonable terms for surrender. After several days of this treatment, the captured defenders were released. Not exchanged, not ransomed, simply returned to their city with a message that they were free to go because Genghis Khan bore no personal animosity toward the common people of Urgench. Their suffering was unnecessary, caused by leaders who cared more about their own pride than their people's welfare. The psychological impact of these returns was devastating. The released defenders brought back stories of Mongol humanity, organization, and genuine concern for civilian welfare. They described their captors not as bloodthirsty barbarians, but as professional soldiers following orders from a leader who preferred mercy to violence when possible. These testimonies created cognitive dissonance that was more destructive than any propaganda campaign. If the Mongols were truly the monsters that resistance leaders claimed, why had they shown such consideration to captured enemies? If they were bent on genocide, why were they offering increasingly generous terms for surrender? The simple act of releasing prisoners without demands created doubt about everything the defenders had been told about their enemies. But the most psychologically sophisticated element of the siege was yet to come. In the 6th month, as winter approached and conditions in the city became desperate, Genghis Khan began what he called the demonstration of alternatives. Rather than continuing to pressure Urgench directly, he temporarily lifted the siege and moved his army to attack a smaller nearby city. The siege of this secondary target was deliberately conducted within sight of Urgench's walls. The defenders could watch through spyglasses as Mongol forces systematically reduced another city's defenses, could see the precisely choreographed assault that overwhelmed the walls in less than a day, could observe the fate of a population that had chosen continued resistance over negotiated surrender. But what they witnessed wasn't the massacre they expected. The conquered city wasn't destroyed. Its population wasn't enslaved or executed. Instead, the inhabitants were gathered in the central square and offered the same choices that had been presented to Urgench months earlier. Accept Mongol authority, contribute to the empire's expansion, and prosper under imperial protection, or continue to resist and face the consequences of that decision. Most of the conquered population chose submission, and within days, they were visibly better off than the defenders of Urgench. They had food, security, and clear roles in the expanding imperial system. Their city began to function normally again, its markets reopened, its families reunited, its future assured. The message was unmistakable. Resistance led to suffering. Submission led to prosperity. The choice was simple, rational, and increasingly obvious to anyone with the intelligence to recognize reality. When the Mongol army returned to Urgench, they found a city transformed. The internal divisions that had been simmering for months had exploded into open civil war. Citizens who had advocated for surrender were fighting citizens who had insisted on resistance. Families were literally destroying themselves over questions that had clear, demonstrable answers. The siege was no longer necessary. Urgench was conquering itself, its people so consumed with internal conflict that they had forgotten about the external threat. When the gates finally opened, it wasn't because the walls had been breached or the defenses overwhelmed. It was because the defenders had decided that Mongol occupation would be preferable to the civil war that continued resistance had created within their own community. The aftermath of Urgench's fall became the template for future Mongol conquests. The city's population wasn't punished for their resistance. Instead, they were thanked for providing such a valuable learning experience. Their siege had allowed Mongol strategists to perfect techniques that would make future conquests faster, more efficient, and ultimately more humane. The defenders who had argued for early surrender were elevated to positions of authority in the new administration. Those who had advocated for continued resistance weren't executed, but were assigned to educational programs designed to help them understand their errors in judgment. The city itself was rebuilt and expanded, becoming a showcase of Mongol administration that other cities could observe and emulate. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Urgench's conquest was what happened to the historical record. The city's chroniclers, rather than recording the siege as a military defeat, were instructed to document it as a learning experience. The months of psychological pressure, the internal divisions, the eventual surrender, all were reframed as a natural process of education through which the population had come to understand the benefits of imperial rule. This wasn't just propaganda. It was a systematic rewriting of reality itself. Future generations would grow up reading accounts of Urgench's liberation by Mongol forces, stories that portrayed the siege not as conquest, but as enlightenment. The city's suffering was described not as punishment, but as the natural growing pains that accompanied the transition from primitive independence to civilized imperial membership. The techniques perfected at Urgench were then applied systematically throughout the expanding empire. Each city faced a customized version of the same psychological pressure, adapted to local conditions and cultural sensitivities, but following the same basic principles. Resistance was made increasingly costly, not just in military terms, but in social and psychological ones. Surrender was presented not as defeat, but as the intelligent choice made by sophisticated people who understood the benefits of imperial order. The results were unprecedented in the history of warfare. Entire regions began surrendering before Mongol armies even arrived, their leaders calculating that early submission would be rewarded more generously than resistance, followed by inevitable defeat. The empire expanded not just through conquest, but through voluntary incorporation, as communities competed to demonstrate their enthusiasm for Mongol rule. But the true measure of Genghis Khan's success wasn't just in the territories he conquered. It was in the fundamental transformation of how human beings thought about resistance, authority, and the relationship between rulers and subjects. His punishments had evolved beyond simple brutality into a comprehensive system for the restructuring of human consciousness itself. The conquered populations didn't just submit to Mongol authority. They came to see submission as natural, resistance as primitive, and imperial rule as the highest form of human organization. This wasn't the result of indoctrination or propaganda. It was the result of punishment so psychologically sophisticated that they rewrote the basic categories through which people understood courage, loyalty, and moral obligation. By the time of his death in 1227, Genghis Khan had created more than the largest contiguous empire in human history. He had created a new understanding of what human beings could be made to accept, to embrace, and ultimately to defend. His legacy wasn't just in the territories he conquered, but in the methods he developed, techniques of psychological control that would influence rulers and governments for centuries to come. The steps had produced not just a conqueror, but a revolutionary, a man who had discovered that the human mind was more malleable than any material, more valuable than any territory, and more easily conquered than any fortress. His punishments had revealed that with sufficient understanding of human psychology, entire civilizations could be made to participate willingly in their own transformation. And perhaps most disturbing of all, his methods worked not because people were weak or cowardly, but because they were rational. When faced with genuine alternatives, most human beings would choose survival over heroism, prosperity over principle, certainty over chaos. Genghis Khan's genius lay not in breaking this tendency, but in understanding it, not in fighting human nature, but in harnessing it. The horror of his achievement wasn't that he had created monsters. It was that he had revealed the monster that lived within ordinary human beings, the capacity for collaboration that existed alongside the capacity for resistance, the willingness to embrace any system that offered security and meaning. His punishments hadn't changed human nature. They had simply revealed its true complexity. In the flickering candlelight of history, Genghis Khan's shadow still stretches across the centuries, a reminder of what becomes possible when intelligence is wedded to ambition, when strategy is married to ruthlessness, and when the systematic study of human weakness becomes the foundation of political power. His punishments echo still, not in the screams of his victims, but in the silence of their descendants, who learned so well the lessons he taught that they forgot there had ever been any other way to live. But as we drift toward the edge of sleep, as these dark tales fade into the realm of dreams and nightmares, remember this. The true horror of Genghis Khan's legacy isn't that such punishments were once possible. It's that the human capacity for both inflicting and accepting them remains, dormant perhaps, but never truly extinct, waiting in the shadows of every civilization, ready to emerge whenever someone with sufficient vision and sufficient ruthlessness decides to test the limits of what human beings can be made to endure. Sleep well, knowing that these particular monsters lived 8 centuries ago. But sleep uneasily, remembering that the darkness they revealed in the human heart has never truly been illuminated, never fully conquered, never permanently banished from the world we have built upon the bones of their empire. And as the winter wind howls across the steppes where his armies once thundered, as the cities he conquered have crumbled back to dust, the most chilling truth about Genghis Khan's punishments isn't what they tell us about medieval brutality. It's what they reveal about the eternal human condition itself. Because here's what the history books rarely admit, what scholars hesitate to acknowledge, what makes his story so deeply unsettling even now. Every technique he perfected, every psychological innovation he developed, every method of breaking human will that he refined in those blood-soaked centuries, they all worked because they exploited something that already existed within us. The capacity to betray our principles when survival is at stake. The willingness to abandon our neighbors when offered a path to safety. The ability to rationalize collaboration as wisdom and resistance as foolishness. Genghis Khan didn't create these weaknesses. He simply understood them better than anyone before or since. He looked into the human soul and saw not nobility or courage or moral certainty, but a complex machine that could be reprogrammed with the right combination of fear and incentive, terror and reward, punishment and mercy. The conquered cities weren't filled with cowards. They were filled with parents who wanted their children to survive, merchants who wanted their businesses to prosper, scholars who wanted their libraries to remain unburned. Rational people making rational choices in impossible circumstances, and therein lies the true horror. His punishments succeeded not because people were weak, but because they were human. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your warm bed, protected by laws and institutions that exist only because someone, somewhere, made the choice to resist rather than submit, remember the lesson carved in blood across the Mongolian steppes. Power doesn't corrupt. Power reveals. And what it revealed in Genghis Khan was a mind capable of understanding human nature so completely that he could reshape entire civilizations simply by understanding what people feared most and what they desired above all else. The screams have long since faded. The cities have been rebuilt. The empires have risen and fallen. But the knowledge remains, encoded in the dark corners of human memory, a reminder that beneath the thin veneer of civilization lies the same species that once knelt before a nomad horseman who had learned to make fear itself into the ultimate weapon. Sleep peacefully if you can. But remember that the capacity for both ultimate cruelty and ultimate submission that Genghis Khan revealed in the 13th century still lives within us all, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to bring it once again into the light. The Khan is dead. His empire is dust, but the darkness he illuminated in the human heart burns eternal, a flame that no amount of progress, no degree of civilization, no passage of time has ever quite managed to extinguish. And perhaps that's the most terrifying punishment of all. Not the ones he inflicted on his enemies, but the one he left for us. The knowledge that under the right pressure, with the right incentives, facing the right choices, any of us might have opened the gates. Any of us might have knelt. Any of us might have found ourselves transformed from victims into agents of our own destruction. And yet, as we close our eyes to these nightmares of the past, as we let the weight of 8 centuries settle between us and the horrors we've witnessed tonight, there remains one final punishment that Genghis Khan never could have anticipated. One that he never designed, never orchestrated, never even imagined. Time itself became his judge. For all his genius in breaking human will, for all his mastery of fear as statecraft, for all his innovations in the systematic destruction of resistance, Genghis Khan could not conquer the one enemy that eventually comes for every tyrant. Memory. Not the memory he tried to control, not the histories he forced his victims to rewrite, but the deeper memory that lives in the collective unconscious of our species. Because here's what happened in the centuries that followed his death. The very techniques he had perfected, the psychological weapons he had forged, they began to turn against his own legacy. The empire he had built on fear started to fragment the moment fear was no longer enough. His descendants, raised on stories of his brilliance, found themselves ruling populations who had learned something he never anticipated they could learn. They had learned to resist invisibly. The conquered peoples didn't rise in open rebellion. That would have been suicide, and Genghis Khan had taught them well the price of direct confrontation. Instead, they developed something far more insidious. They learned to submit with their bodies while keeping their souls intact. They discovered that the human spirit, unlike human flesh, could not be broken by any punishment, no matter how sophisticated. In the markets of Samarkand, in the temples of Beijing, in the quiet corners of every conquered city, people began to whisper. Not the desperate whispers of the defeated, but something else entirely. Stories, memories, fragments of who they had been before the horsemen came. And slowly, generation by generation, those whispers became songs. Those songs became legends. And those legends became something Genghis Khan's punishments had tried to destroy forever: hope. The children who had been adopted into Mongol families, who had been raised to see their conquerors as liberators, they began to dream strange dreams, dreams of places they had never seen, of languages they had never heard spoken, of gods whose names had been forbidden for decades. Something deeper than memory, something encoded in their very bones, began to resurface. The scholars who had been forced to rewrite their histories, to praise barbarian wisdom and condemn their own heritage, they developed a secret language, hidden meanings embedded in official documents, coded references that only other scholars would understand. They created a shadow library of truth that existed alongside the official propaganda, preserving what was real beneath layers of what was required. And the merchants, those practical souls who had embraced Mongol rule for its economic benefits, they became the carriers of a different kind of currency. Not gold or silver, but information. Stories from distant lands about peoples who had never knelt to the great Khan. Proof that somewhere beyond the empire's borders, resistance was not just possible, but successful. This was the punishment Genghis Khan never saw coming. The punishment of his own success. By creating an empire so vast, by conquering so completely, by integrating so many different peoples into his system, he had inadvertently created the conditions for his own legacy's destruction. The very networks he had built to maintain control became the pathways through which resistance could spread. But perhaps most ironically, his greatest innovation, the systematic use of fear as a tool of governance, eventually became his greatest weakness. Because fear, no matter how skillfully applied, is not a renewable resource. It requires constant reinforcement, constant demonstration, constant renewal. And the moment those demonstrations stop, the moment that fear begins to fade, people remember something that even the most sophisticated punishments cannot erase. They remember that they are human, and humans, at their core, yearn to be free. The Mongol Empire lasted less than 2 centuries in its unified form. By the 14th century, it had splintered into warring fragments. By the 15th century, those fragments were being conquered by the descendants of the very peoples Genghis Khan had once terrorized into submission. The techniques he had developed were turned against his own successors by rulers who had learned his methods, but also learned their limitations. The Chinese, who had been forced to collaborate in their own subjugation, eventually drove out their Mongol overlords and established the Ming dynasty. The Islamic world, which had seen its greatest libraries burned and its scholars scattered, produced new centers of learning that surpassed anything that had existed before the conquest. The European kingdoms, which had trembled at reports of Mongol brutality, developed new forms of military organization that made nomadic cavalry obsolete. Each of these reversals carried within it the shadow of Genghis Khan's own methods. The Ming emperors used psychological warfare to unite their people against foreign rule. Islamic scholars developed new techniques of resistance that operated below the threshold of direct confrontation. European nobles created systems of collective defense that made the kind of divide and conquer strategies the Mongols had perfected impossible to implement. The student had become the teacher. The victim had become the victor. And the great innovator of punishment found his own innovations turned against his legacy with devastating effectiveness. But even this wasn't the final irony. The ultimate punishment that time inflicted on Genghis Khan was more subtle and more complete than military defeat or political collapse. It was the transformation of his memory itself. The man who had devoted his life to controlling how he would be remembered, who had forced entire civilizations to rewrite their histories in his favor, discovered that he could not control his own legend. In the centuries that followed, Genghis Khan became a mythical figure, but not the myth he had intended to create. Instead of being remembered as the wise unifier who had brought peace through strength, he became a symbol of everything humanity had learned to reject: cruelty for its own sake, power without restraint, the worship of force over justice. Modern historians would eventually rehabilitate some aspects of his legacy, pointing to the trade routes he opened, the technologies he spread, the cultural exchanges he facilitated. But in the popular imagination, in the stories mothers told their children, and the cautionary tales that shaped moral understanding, Genghis Khan became the boogeyman. The name parents invoked to frighten their children into obedience. The example teachers used to illustrate the dangers of unchecked ambition. His punishments, which had once terrorized half the world into submission, became bedtime stories. His innovations in psychological warfare became object lessons in what happens when power is divorced from humanity. The man who had sought to make himself synonymous with inevitable victory instead became synonymous with inevitable defeat, because time, as it turns out, is the one judge that cannot be bribed, cannot be intimidated, cannot be converted through clever arguments or sophisticated pressure techniques. Time simply watches and waits and eventually renders its own verdict. The verdict on Genghis Khan's punishments was clear. They worked brilliantly for a historical moment. They conquered vast territories, subjugated millions of people, created the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen. But they could not do the one thing their creator most desperately wanted them to do. They could not make that empire eternal. And so tonight, as these dark chronicles finally draw to their close, as we prepare to surrender consciousness to the realm of dreams and nightmares, we're left with a final question, one that echoes across the centuries from the steppes of Mongolia to the comfort of our modern beds. One that Genghis Khan himself might have asked if he had lived long enough to see his empire crumble, his methods copied and turned against his successors, his memory transformed from divine mandate into cautionary tale. Was it worth it? All that suffering, all that innovation and cruelty, all that systematic destruction of human dignity and will, all those punishments that redefined what it meant to resist and what it meant to submit. Did they achieve anything lasting? Did they create anything of permanent value? Did they leave the world a better place than it had been before the horsemen rode out of the steppes with terror in their hearts and blood on their hands? The answer, whispered by 8 centuries of wind across the grasslands where his armies once thundered, is both simple and complex. Yes, they achieved something lasting, but not what he intended, not what he planned, not what he dreamed of in those final moments before death claimed even the great Khan. They achieved a lesson, a warning, a reminder carved in the bones of history itself about the ultimate futility of ruling through fear alone. They demonstrated that no punishment, no matter how sophisticated, can permanently suppress the human desire for dignity. They proved that no empire, no matter how vast, can survive without the consent of the governed. Genghis Khan's punishments became humanity's education in the limits of power. His victims became our teachers in the strength of the human spirit. His empire became our proof that even the most brilliant tyranny contains the seeds of its own destruction. And perhaps, in the end, that is the most fitting punishment of all. Not that he failed, but that his failure taught us something valuable. Not that he was forgotten, but that he was remembered for all the wrong reasons. Not that his techniques were abandoned, but that they became the standard by which we measure what civilized people must never do to one another. So sleep well tonight, knowing that the darkness we've explored together serves a purpose. It reminds us why the light matters. It shows us what we've learned to reject. It proves that even the most sophisticated cruelty cannot ultimately triumph over the simple human insistence that we deserve to be treated with dignity. The steppes are quiet now. The horses have returned to dust. The empire has crumbled into historical footnotes and academic debates. But the lesson remains, echoing through the centuries like a prayer whispered in the darkness. Power without mercy is not strength. It is weakness disguised as strength. Fear without justice is not order. It is chaos wearing the mask of order. And punishment without compassion is not governance. It is simply cruelty dressed up in the language of necessity and doomed to ultimate failure. Genghis Khan conquered the world, but the world in the end conquered him, and that perhaps is the most terrifying and most comforting truth of all. Sweet dreams, everyone. And remember, when morning comes, that we live in a world that learned, slowly and at terrible cost, to choose mercy over fear, justice over power, and hope over the systematic destruction of the human spirit. The Khan is dead. Long live humanity.